the success of this is to so many people, and it's our partners that have co-sponsored this, who've shared the promotion of the book club. So today I'd like to reiterate thanks to Notre Dame International, the Keough Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, the College of Arts and Letters, the Keough Global School of Global Affairs, Notre Dame Learning, and of course the Notre Dame Alumni Association. This program would not have been possible without the team that was assembled and whose agility, creativity, and concerted efforts has made this book club run so smoothly. So on behalf of Barry and myself, thank you so much. So just a little bit of administration for this week. We, as you know, we have the opportunity to discuss Alfred Hitchcock's The Rear Window in the context of lockdown. And I find, at least personally, I found going back and watching this film a real treat, an opportunity to see Rear Window as Ireland enters out of our final phase of lockdown, and how the 1954 film's intensity and relevance holds up so well today, as Barry has so eloquently discussed in his filmed lecture clips. As is our tradition, we will have a 10-minute breakout session so that you all can continue to meet each other and discuss topics and to discuss the film in small groups. Should you not wish to break out, you are more than welcome to stay in the main room until the groups have had the opportunity to reflect, and then they'll come back and rejoin the main group. So no need to feel you have to be in a breakout session. We also ask that if you have questions for Barry, that you please use the Google form that we are now sharing with you. It just makes it easier for us to loop the questions in. So if you can please use the Google form, this will allow us to facilitate the questions in a timely manner. But please remember that if we don't get to all of them, that we do have that LinkedIn moderated discussion board, or if you're not wanting to join LinkedIn, you're more than welcome to email me directly, and we can continue the discussion of the Rear Window. So now let's turn it over to Barry. And as you know, we promoted this event. We shared a few pre-recorded videos that were posted on ThinkND, where Barry discussed the themes for the film. For those of you who have not had a chance to watch it, I do recommend you going back into ThinkND and look at the 3 clips. And so now, Barry, I'd like to welcome you and talk about Hitchcock's film, The Rear Window. What a great movie. And thank you for such insightful lectures this week.
Thanks a million, Lisa. Welcome back, everybody. I was watching the film, rewatching the film the other night, and I was struck by the fact that this is probably something of a curveball that I've thrown you. The Decameron, after all, was set during a literal plague, and Camus' novel is also set in a plague. But this is a film that is set not in a plague, and not even in wartime, but in a more ordinary circumstance. But I think it probably struck all of you, and I know not all of you have had a chance either to watch the movie or to watch my pre-recorded lecture. So I'm just going to, in the next few minutes, go through some of the main points that I covered there. So don't worry if you haven't seen the film or if you haven't seen the lectures. But as I was saying, for those of us who've watched this film during COVID-19, I think certain things jump out at us that wouldn't have jumped out at people watching it in other times. So people who haven't lived through lockdown as we have wouldn't have seen the same things. I certainly didn't see the same things in this film when I saw it pre-COVID. So I suppose the central point that I see in this film of relevance to us is that Hitchcock is always working, as a film director, he's always working on both a psychological and a literal level. So he builds fantastic stories that are true feeling and exciting and suspenseful, but they're also, as well as just being stories, they're ways of exploring human psychology. And the reason I put this film on our course in the book club is because what he does in this film is takes the predicament of lockdown as a way to explore human psychology. He takes lockdown and quarantine as a sort of portal into the human mind, especially the male mind. So that's why it's relevant to us. It is a film centers around one man, Jeff, who's in a form of quarantine. He's injured and he's at home and he's confined to his apartment because of a leg injury. And as usual, Hitchcock is interested in individual psychology, and in many strange and sly ways, the film gives us a psychological portrait of this man. But I think the historical background of the film is also very important for our purposes in trying to understand what the film has to say about lockdown. So it's a film from 1954, so it's less than a decade after the end of the Second World War. So the background, the historical background to this film is a population that had been mobilized for the war. People that had been sent abroad, who had seen combat in France or Japan, or who were there as medical personnel, as nurses or whatever, or who were deployed on the home front in munitions factories or intelligence or whatever. So people had experienced very changed lives due to the Second World War. And in the 1950s, they are being re-domesticated. They're returning to ordinary life. So people who are heroes in the battlefield are just going back and becoming, dads who look after the garden or whatever it is. So we have people being re-domesticated. And Jeff's story, as you know, he's a something like a war photographer. So his job is connected to that sort of activity. And his story is in part an exploration of the difficulties of this transition. As I was saying, this film is about what happens to the mind and to the self when, instead of roaming around in the outside world, they unexpectedly find themselves confined to home. When we no longer have the stimuli of travel, moving around, socializing, variety of people, variety of locations, what happens to the mind? So we see what happens to a mind squeezed suddenly into a small domestic space and into a restricted, repetitive time, a mind that was used to a big open space of time and to traveling. So one of the things this film suggests is that when external stimuli are reduced, the internal mind compensates. So when we have fewer external stimuli, the internal mind generates internal stimuli to compensate. So that sounds fine on the face of it, but that is obviously a form of what we might call madness. And so one of the things we might take to comfort ourselves in this film is that being confined to the home, especially unexpectedly, but being confined to the home in general, drives everybody mad. So it's not just us. Everybody is driven mad by it. And there is an obvious reason for it, which is this, that the internal stimuli are increased. So the volume gets turned up in what is inside our heads to compensate for the volume being turned down on life outside. So, one of the words we use to describe madness is unbalanced. And I suppose we're talking about a basic imbalance between the inside, the internal psychological world, and the outside world. In a way, what happens in lockdown is that the mind becomes a sort of monoculture, like a weed that suddenly can take over a garden. So our obsessions and fixations and fears and disturbing thoughts in lockdown are suddenly free to run wild. They don't have natural predators, as it were. So they're given free rein. Our moods fill the space we're in when there's nothing to stop them. So they take on a special reality. So I'm not saying that everything that happens in this film is just in Jeff's imagination, but I am saying that is one of the ways in which Hitchcock is tempting us to read what's happening, that this is an internal world which suddenly takes on an external seeming reality. Central to this reality is the frustration of being locked in. Jeff can't move physically or mentally, or imaginatively as he would like to or as he's used to doing. And the film emphasizes again and again a sense of the self as being somehow limited or partial or lacking or impotent. And it makes a number of jokes, if you look at the film again, a number of jokes about the word impotent and finding all sorts of levels in it. So the film is very focused on the question of compensation. When we don't have external stimuli, when we can't do what we want or move around as we want, we see a series of compensations come into play. So the film nods to this in many different ways, but one of them is the preoccupation, or at least the repeated instances of prostheses in it. So he has his back scratcher, for example. There's the ever bigger camera lenses that he adds onto his camera. There's lots of things like that in it, but there's constant emphasis on prostheses, so things to try and compensate for a lack. So already the film is talking about the compensations that the mind engages in when it is in a restricted physical setting. In this film, the key compensation is obviously watching. And it's a film, if it's about one thing, it's about watching. And there's scene after scene after scene of watching. So watching in this film is an attempt to travel internally, if you like, to travel in the mind when it's no longer possible to travel physically. But it's also, and this is part of the creepy film that feminist critics in the sense of people who've analyzed the film, they've often pointed to, is that it's also an attempt to reassert a lost power. A sense of powerlessness produces a compensatory mechanism of watching, of turning things and consuming things as images. So the film functions on a number of different levels. On one level, and it is perfectly acceptable level, Hitchcock wants us to enjoy it in this way as a real murder mystery. Somebody is looking at his neighbors, there's a murder, they solve it. It's not that that doesn't happen. But the film leaves us with a series of, as I said in the recorded lecture, a series of strange, creepy feelings we can't quite account for. And that's because it's also working on the level as a psychological exploration, and especially a psychological exploration of how the mind compensates to being locked down. So one of the ways we can understand the events is as a projection of the internal world on the exterior world. And that word projection is interesting, and I'll end with this thought, because it's also a way, I think, for Hitchcock to look at some of the unsavory aspects of cinema, of ways in which the movies are a compensatory fantasy for things that we are missing, or sense of power that people feel they're missing in their real lives. Okay, sorry I had to rush through that at such a gallop because of my internet going down. But so now we're going to send you into breakout rooms. So just for those of you who are new, you don't have to have seen the lectures or the movie to go into a room. You also don't have to go into a breakout room if you don't want to, but you're encouraged to. And you can always leave at any time if you don't like it in there. So rule number one of the rooms is be nice to each other, listen to each other, be civil. The second one is you all should pick a leader, a group leader, and you can either just pick it randomly or just come and decide among yourselves, or if you really can't, just pick the person whose birthday falls earliest in the year. That's one quick way you can do it if you want. So introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about what you got from the lectures or from the film, or if you haven't seen it, just about some of the issues, talk about some of the issues I've raised now. And then I would like you to give your group leader, so as a group, come up with 2 questions that you would like Lisa and myself to talk about after the groups come back. So 2 questions arising from the film or from my lectures or from the short little talk I just gave you there that you'd like to talk about later. And up on your screen there, you should see the link to submit your questions and comments. So again, sorry that I had to rush through that so fast, and I'll see you after your groups.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your Zoomed breakout session. I like how we zoom you out and then zoom you back into us. I just wanted to remind everyone that we're sharing in the Google form link. So if you can just fill out any questions that you have in that form, then I'll be able to address them according to the theme. So let's start with my colleague, Barry, in NDI, Judy Hutchison, writes this. Barry, I was fascinated by all the insights you had on how one of the themes throughout the film was on marriage, with many of the couples there. I was really interested when you talked about how viewing, as in a film, made the woman something to be desired, including Grace Kelly, who you said only became desirable when she entered into the stage. You mentioned so many other themes. I wonder, is it possible that all of these many themes were directly intended by Hitchcock? Or is it that we can draw some of our own conclusions based upon our own situations? And she says, P.S., Jimmy Stewart, huge crush. Judy, I totally agree.
No, that's a very good question, and I think it's both things at once. That what Hitchcock is trying to do is to produce an effect in his viewers, something that will unsettle them and make them aware. I mean, I suppose aware on different levels, but aware on a conscious, perhaps also unconscious level, of certain phenomena, including phenomena to do with just watching movies themselves. So I think a lot of it is put in deliberately because he clearly knows a lot about psychology and psychoanalysis, and he's obviously thought a lot about the relationships between men and women, the ways in which men view women, the role that looking at women has in cinema. But I think Judy's right that what he really creates is a system more than a message, if you know what I mean. That it's the film is a system for us to interact with that works upon us, and it works upon each individual differently. In fact, one of the creepiest things about Hitchcock's films, and this is a great example of it, is that it sort of triggers each things that are already inside each viewer. It sort of activates certain things in us and activates certain feelings, and it's not going to be the same for each person. But he does know how to get under our skin. He finds ways that get under nearly everybody's skin, I think.
He was a control freak, is what I understood too. When he's directing, he was very controlled of the set, controlled of the environment. The elaborate set for Rear Window was so elaborate that he was able to control the daylight and the nighttime such that it was extremely hot. So when we see Jimmy Stewart opening he is sweating from being so warm in such a controlled environment. Okay, so the next question, again, it's to do with relationships. You mentioned the centrality of marriage in the film. Can you see the exclusivity of marriage and its attendant settling down as another form of lockdown, which Jeff is trying to avoid, which leads Thorwald to murder? Just wondering.
Oh yeah, that's a great comment. That he's afraid of losing his freedom. I mean, one of the things the film suggests is that if you're too afraid of losing your freedom, you actually take your own freedom away from you. You know that he's actually lopping off parts of himself in his attempt to stay free. So that is one of the things the film is, I think, suggesting. But because it is a film about the fear of losing freedom and the fear of being confined or restricted or imprisoned, and he associates that with marriage at the beginning. But it's also clear that his attempts to remain independent are also crippling him in ways. You know, this obsession with his independence are also things that take it away, that make him kind of frozen and rigid and imprisoned as a human being. So it works on all those sorts of levels, yeah.
When you were briefly whizzed out, I talked a bit about how kind of Jimmy Stewart's like the everyman, and he's, but he's been cast as this sort of chauvinistic and has, exhibits monstrous kind of behavior at times towards her. Then, especially going back to it, you really see this sense of reluctance to commit to her, which is, but then also like until she enters into his frame, that he can actually see her for what she is. So I suppose this leads to the other question of like, clearly Grace Kelly's this beautiful symbol of beauty, and what kind of tropes is he trying to show up here with the kind of sexualization of her and the people that he sees, and his inability to connect to her, but yet he's able to connect to these women on these in these windows?
Well, one thing I think Hitchcock is suggesting is that it's very easy to connect to somebody who is just an image, or somebody that you can kind of just label with a very simple identity, like Miss Torso or Miss Lonely Hearts. That it's very easy to have a relationship with a full, complex human being that you can't control in that way is much harder. And so, and like as you say, when you watch it again, you see all these ways in which he's trying to avoid being attached to her. He wants to get rid of her. And the kind of symbolic version of that is the murder that happens across the way. That's the sort of unconscious side of it. But actually then, if you watch the film then a third time, you start to see that she has more power in it than you realize. That she is, there are ways in which she wants to confine him. She wants to box him into just an easy packageable version of something that she can consume. And at the very end of the film, she's the one who's watching him. He's asleep, she's awake, she's looking at him. So the power dynamics are very subtle and they shift back and forth. And every time I watch it, I kind of come down on a different side, on who is really the jailer and who is really the prisoner in this. It'll be very hard to really come down definitely on one side or another, I think. She's a more canny operator than she seems, because she's Grace Kelly and she's so whispering and delightful and submissive in ways. It also hides the fact in which she is also actually a powerful character who knows what she wants and is looking for it.
I wonder if you can comment to this, like to watch is to be in power, but to be watched is to be vulnerable. And in a way, her movement is from, the observer to being observed for him too. I wonder if you can comment to that.
Yeah, so that's a bit like what I just said. So on the one hand, he is this, if we think of that, to view is to exert power, to control somebody and to make them vulnerable. So on one level, he's the viewer. So he's there and he's always watching everybody, he's constantly looking. They're kind of even put into little boxes for his own viewing pleasure. On the other hand, everybody can escape his view. So they can, once they turn left or right down that little piece of street, they're outside his view. So it's a very limited power. And that's why I think it's more of a compensation, more of kind of a fantasy of power than real power. All this emphasis on Jeff watching. But it is clear in the dynamics of the film that once the gaze is turned back on Jeff, he's in trouble.
So we have another question about voyeurism as an attempt to reassert mastery and control and keeping in line with this, something that you had said in the lecture for. Can you draw a parallel between this and kind of our contemporary addiction to social media, especially in lockdown?
I suppose to some aspects of social media, in a way, some aspects of what they call call-out culture is a bit like that, or where people, video each other, or they take a film of somebody against their knowledge or against their will, and then they're humiliated by that. I suppose that is part of it. It's a way of exercising power. That's true. Yeah. I think reality TV, which now seems like an old-fashioned medium, but we used to think was going to take over the world, that's another type of it. It's part of it, or example of it, where we exercise a pleasure in watching people that are only half aware of being watched.
Well, I thought that was interesting because we do have a fascination, or at least millennials may have more of a fascination with reality TV, but the concept of like soap operas, like our Fair City or Santa Barbara or Guy, like over the years, they have been like, this is not something new. Like 1954 is revealing an obsession with this genre of observation, or trying to.
Yeah, you're right, Lisa. And something that's really, I think, crucial in the film is it plays on a desire that we all have, which is to watch people or watch the world without the world knowing that we're watching, and that's to see what everybody's like when they don't know we're there. That for all our lives we live in the world what they call the observer's paradox, which is that the fact of us being there changes everybody's behavior around us. We don't know what people are like when we're not there. It's a very basic fantasy that we are, impulse that we all have, which is it's a bit like being at your own funeral or something, seeing what everything is like, what the world is like when they don't know you're in it. I think the film plays a lot on that. That it's a very basic impulse.
I want to talk a bit about loneliness and lockdown. Like it seems like Miss Lonely Heart, like I identified with Miss Lonely Heart, especially when she's about to take the pills and then she's suddenly stopped because of the musician's piece of music, this music that, so I was just wondering if you could talk about a bit about the subject of loneliness in this and how we can relate to it.
Well, I don't. When if anybody else had this thought, when I was watching the film the last time, last week, and I saw the party in the musician's house, I got kind of stressed because I thought, oh my God, nobody's distancing, nobody's wearing a mask, all these people are, and it made me think how cruel this experience has been for us. That it's very hard for us to share the experience with other people. That there's one of the things that is truly cruel about this lockdown is that. We're not able to do it with others. But the film does emphasize the importance of experiencing things collectively. I know I say this every week, but I think this film underlines it again, the importance of experiencing things collectively, and not just looking at each other or observing each other or judging each other, but actually trying to share in an experience with others. That the opposite of that is a form of madness. To think that you can build the whole world from your own room and just consume others or look at others rather than cooperating with them or being involved collectively with them, that is a form of mental imbalance. And we've all had that imbalance. It's been inevitable. We need to now find ways to rebalance it, I think, to fill our lives with others again.
I have Roberta from South Bend asking that the question about how some apartment dwellers keep their blinds open, allowing themselves to be viewed constantly, just as some of us on Zoom choose to use video and be seen by others in gallery view or in breakout rooms. Others lower their blinds selectively. What makes some of us want to display ourselves to others? Do we feel safe enough to do so? Do we want to connect with others or show off like Miss Torso? Do lockdown conditions affect our choice to view or to be viewed?
I think for some people it makes their lives feel, and this is not at all a criticism, it makes their lives feel more real to imagine they're being observed by somebody else. So to imagine that your life is kind of a movie, basically, and makes your life seem more interesting, more appetizing. And I think for that reason, some people want you to see, the kitchen and people moving around and the lovely books you have on your shelf. And it's not it's not necessarily showing off. I think there's something nice about imagining somebody else looking at your life like it was a movie. Other people find it intrusive and want to protect their they feel that their private sphere is vulnerable or will be contaminated by the gaze of other people. I don't think either is right or wrong, or at least I think both are right. I think there's no harm in it. But the film is really thinking about that too, imagining your own life as a movie watched by others.
This question is from Debbie from Bath in England. What is the significance of torso and the message Hitchcock was conveying to us? What is the analysis or perception of violence against women included in the film?
Well, I think with that, Hitchcock is really looking at some of the more disturbing habits of cinema, which is, and we're so inured to it now that we hardly even notice it. But if you just watch, like say, advertisements on Netflix for new series, so many of them revolve around disappearing or murdered women. So many of them begin with the discovery of body parts, nearly always women's body parts, and Hitchcock is just raising that as a question. I don't think he's coming down in any very clear way on what that means, but he is raising it. There's something violent underlying the kind of visual pleasure we get in the cinema, and there's something something violent about the way gender works in the cinema that he's highlighting. And as you said, he himself was a terrible boy. I mean, Tippi Hedren was traumatized by having to work for him. So I'm not saying that Hitchcock, was a great feminist or that you'd want your friend to, marry him, or let alone act in his movies. But in his work, he does explore these disturbing sides of cinema, I think. And I suppose, so what he brings together two things. One is just the very literal and gruesome dismemberment of body. That's what happens to Mrs. Thorwald. One leg in the East River, Stella says, and bits and pieces of her everywhere. And the way in which certain types of cinema, let's say, certain types of Hollywood, reduce people to body parts for the pleasure of the viewer. He brings those two things together. It's one of the things that's so troubling about the film, I think.
If I remember reading correctly, Barry, it's based on a short story, and the short story was actually based on an occurrence that happened in a British media. Okay, the next question we have is from Fritz Heinzen. Our group loved the use of Rear Window for this book club. 2 of the 4 were new watchers of the film. We wondered if you could elaborate more on the eyes, how Stewart's eyes are a key to what is going on and in which direction. It reminded one of Flannery O'Connor's The Violent Bear It Away, and how the eyes are a key component to understanding that story.
Oh, what a great question. One of the things Hitchcock is playing on, and I'm not going to go too far with it because he's also tempting us to go too far with it, as a trap, but is the old symbolic connection between blindness and castration, and that's a connection that goes back a long way. So we have this male character who feels in some way disempowered, incomplete. He's afraid of women. There's a lot of scenes early on of women physically overpowering him. There's one where he's sleeping and Lisa I'm sorry that it's your name, Lisa, by the way. I know that it leans in and her shadow falls across him, or Stella's kind of, moving him around. So there's a sense that he's being overpowered by women, and that he tries to compensate somehow with his eyes. And he has all of these instruments to kind of augment the power of his eyes. The binoculars, the camera lens, the bigger camera lens. And then finally, in the end, what he does is he blinds his opponent. So there is some sense of the eyes as being compensating for some other kind of lack. And Hitchcock, again, without coming down, giving us a clear message, connects that somehow to cinema, to what the deepest impulses behind cinema are. He connects it to that, the desire to augment a kind of sense, or to compensate for a sense of powerlessness by some sort of visual power. Watching.
Well, now that you talk about powerlessness, I was struck by the kind of reminiscence of paralysis that you like Jimmy's paralysis or Jeff's paralysis, but it reminded me of the Dubliners, and that, in Eveline's and Frank's relationship, like that, there's that paralysis and that kind of circular nature of the Dubliners. And I just wondering if you see that as well in the Dubliners, and if you can comment to that.
Well, I was thinking of the other story, the one Ignatius Gallagher and where the person who's able to move, so the person who goes away from Dublin, goes to England and comes back, has this sense of glamour and extraordinary powers for the person who is immobilized. So the person who is stuck in Dublin, the person who moves away and comes back, is able to move back, feels like they have these extraordinary and quite frightening powers. And that's true in Rear Window too, that the people who are able to go out onto the streets and go to those other places have this power that Jeff doesn't have. And so he's constantly trying to compensate for it. And also that means that they seem almost kind of unworldly creatures because they're out there in the real world.
We have another one coming up here from Roberta in South Bend. Ultimately, Jeff's conclusion and ours that Thorwald is a murderer is correct. Yet in other cases, we and Jeff draw inaccurate conclusions because we only see some pieces of the total picture. Example, he only sees Lisa as a socialite, not as an adventuresome woman, until she crawls up the balcony. We think Miss Torso is a gold digger until we see her happy reunion with her awkward army boyfriend. At what point can we have confidence in the accuracy of our own interpretation of what we see? When does interpretation become proof?
Yeah, well, that's the whole question of the film, isn't it? Or one of them. That we were left with this uneasy feeling that there's things that there are certain unanswered questions left in the film that we don't know. There's something about the relationship between Jeff and Lisa that is still not fully grasped by us. And especially the very end suggests that there's more to Lisa than we thought. So who speaks the truth in the film? Stella maybe, but she gets things wrong at the beginning too. There's something about the Torvalds we don't know. I think the question, Roberta's question, in a way, the answer is in the question. It's one of the key doubts that the film pivots on. It's one of the ways in which the film leaves us feeling weird, I think, is that we're just not quite sure, not even 100% sure if all the interpretations that seem right really are so reliable.
Kira from Dublin asks, you've been given an unlimited budget. If you were a modern day Hitchcock, how would you remake the film for a post-lockdown audience in a way that addresses all the social issues that we have talked about?
What a good question. Well, one of the things the film also has, one of the aspects of it is also social class, that the class difference between them is subtle but very important thread running through it. And I think I would love to see a film that took the point of view of people who we usually see in the background, people who are usually watched, and to take them as the watchers. So maids, for example, or housekeepers, or shopkeepers. I'd like to see a film from that point of view. So say, for example, some of the people who have kept going to work during our lockdown are people who work in stores, just shop assistants or supermarket checkout people. That would be an interesting point of view to build a film around. Somebody who is immobilized behind the checkout, and the people who are on lockdown come in one by one on their very panicked, brief errands to the supermarket to buy their things. I think you could start there. That's somebody who's immobilized. They're usually in the background of films, but to make that the center of the film, to make the gaze from behind the supermarket checkout, the kind of the gaze that anchors the film, that would be an interesting one, I think. That sounds quite low budget, actually, so I find ways to spend the rest of it.
Well, RTE had a really good program on about, like, from the patient's perspective, I thought too. So it would be interesting to see, like, you're physically immobile, and if, for those who can, like, similar to Jimmy or / Jeff in the film, if, to view the world from being immobile and how it has changed your perception. Well, on that note, I think I want to draw this very interesting, and thank you for bringing the movie back to us, because what a movie to rewatch again. Always has these layers of revelation. So I want to extend a warm thank you to everyone who's joined us. And like I said, if we've been too short with our discussion today, please send us a question on the LinkedIn discussion board. And just a reminder for next week that we'll be discussing the Camus, the plague, and the part 4 is on Think ND right now with the shorter explainer videos by Barry. So I encourage you to review and to go back and read the book or read it for the first time if you haven't already. And please feel free to share this series with your friends. We are still accepting registrations throughout the entire program. And as each program is a standalone, so please encourage people to come. I also just want to say at the end, I know this is a holiday weekend, so I just want to, on behalf of the team here at Kylemore, I want to wish you all and yours a very safe and well, and happy 4th of July. And that we look forward to welcome you to Ireland someday in the future when the lockdown is over. Thanks again for joining. Happy 4th of July. Take care.